Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're diving into the world of medieval medicine, where the cure was usually worse than the disease, and your local doctor's qualifications included owning a sharp knife and having strong opinions about your bodily humors. Before we begin this delightful tour through medical malpractice history, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of historical suffering, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why the past was medically terrifying. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining me for these midnight medical nightmares. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on some white noise, and settle in as we explore why getting sick in medieval times was essentially a death sentence with extra steps. Tonight's journey will make you grateful for modern antibiotics, anesthesia, and the revolutionary concept that maybe washing your hands before surgery is a good idea. Chapter 1. The Four Humors When Medicine Was Just Guessing. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors, which sounds sophisticated until you realize it was essentially a 1,500-year-old game of medical mad libs. According to this theory, your body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these were in balance, you were healthy. When they weren't, you were sick, crazy, or dead. The solution to almost every medical problem was to remove some of these fluids from your body, preferably in the most unpleasant way possible. Blood was considered hot and moist, associated with spring and the element of air. Too much blood made you sanguine, which sounds positive but actually meant you were prone to fever, headaches, and apparently excessive happiness. The cure was bloodletting because medieval doctors believed that if a little blood loss was good, a lot of blood loss was obviously better. Phlegm was cold and moist, linked to winter and water. An excess of phlegm made you phlegmatic, meaning sluggish, pale, and prone to respiratory problems. The treatment involved purging, sweating, and consuming heating herbs that would make you vomit. Because nothing says medical treatment like deliberate food poisoning. Yellow bile was hot and dry, connected to summer and fire. Too much yellow bile made you choleric, angry, ambitious, and prone to digestive problems. The cure involved cooling treatments like cucumber water and, you guessed it, more bloodletting. Medieval medicine was nothing if not consistent in its wrongness. Black bile was cold and dry, associated with autumn and earth. An excess of black bile caused melancholia, what we'd now recognize as depression. The treatment involved warming foods, exercise, and music therapy, which actually wasn't terrible advice, mixed in with the usual bleeding and purging because medieval doctors couldn't help themselves. The diagnostic process was equally sophisticated. Doctors would examine your urine color, smell, and taste to determine which humors were out of balance. They had elaborate charts showing different urine colors and what they meant for your health. Clear urine meant one thing, cloudy urine meant another, and red urine meant you should probably start writing your will. Astrological timing was crucial for all treatments. Each humor was associated with different planets and zodiac signs, so the effectiveness of your treatment depended on celestial alignment. Got sick during Mercury retrograde? Sorry, you'll have to wait for the stars to align properly before we can cure you. This added an element of cosmic gambling to medical care that somehow made it even less reliable. The theory of humors also determined your personality and career prospects. Sanguine people became soldiers or lovers, choleric people became leaders, phlegmatic people became scholars, and melancholic people became artists. Your medical condition was essentially your LinkedIn profile, except LinkedIn profiles don't usually recommend bloodletting as professional development. Temperature regulation was obsessed over to an almost comical degree. Foods, herbs, medicines, and even thoughts were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry. Eating a hot food when you had a hot condition could supposedly kill you. So meal planning required a degree in medieval thermodynamics. Cold cucumber for hot fevers, warm wine for cold phlegm, and apparently no one ever considered that maybe food temperature and disease had nothing to do with each other. The most frustrating part of humoral theory was that it was just plausible enough to persist for over a millennium. Some of the observations were accurate. Fever does involve heat. Depression can make you feel cold and sluggish. But the explanations were completely wrong. It was like having a broken clock that was right twice a day, except the clock was your entire medical system and people's lives depended on it. Chapter 2. Bloodletting, the cure that killed more than it helped. If medieval medicine had a greatest hit, it would be bloodletting. This practice was the medical equivalent of percussive maintenance. When something's broken, hit it until it works or stops moving entirely. For over 1,000 years, European doctors treated almost every ailment by removing blood from patients, apparently convinced that the human body was just overstuffed with the stuff. The theory behind bloodletting was that disease was caused by corrupted blood, so removing the bad blood would allow the body to produce fresh, healthy blood. This made a certain intuitive sense, like changing the oil in your car, except your car doesn't die when you drain all the oil out of it. Medieval patients weren't so lucky. There were several methods of bloodletting, each more unpleasant than the last. Venesection involved cutting open a vein, usually in the arm, and letting blood drain into a bowl. Doctors had elaborate charts showing which vein to cut based on the patient's condition, age, and astrological sign. Get the wrong vein, and you might accidentally cure the wrong disease, which was apparently a legitimate medical concern. Cupping was another popular method, involving heated glass cups placed on the skin to create suction. The vacuum would draw blood to the surface, causing dark bruises that looked like you'd been attacked by a particularly vindictive octopus. Sometimes the skin would be scarified, deliberately cut before cupping to actually draw blood. It was like getting a hickey, if hickeys were prescribed by doctors and could kill you. Leeches were the premium bloodletting option, considered more precise than crude cutting. These slimy little vampires would be applied to specific body parts to remove blood gradually. Doctors kept jars full of leeches and would prescribe them like pills. Take 2 leeches and call me in the morning. The leeches themselves had to be properly maintained, fed, and kept healthy, which means medieval doctors were also responsible for leech husbandry. The amount of blood removed was staggering by modern standards. Doctors would drain several pints at a time, often repeatedly over several days. Patients who were already weakened by illness would lose dangerous amounts of blood, leaving them pale, weak, and often worse than when they started. But hey, at least their humors were balanced. Bloodletting was considered appropriate for virtually every condition. Headache, bloodletting. Broken bone, bloodletting. Pregnancy complications, more bloodletting. The common cold, you know what's coming. It was the medieval equivalent of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Except instead of electronics, it was your circulatory system. The timing of bloodletting was crucial and followed complex astrological calculations. Each zodiac sign was associated with different body parts, and bleeding during the wrong astrological period could supposedly be fatal. Aries governed the head, so head complaints should only be bled during Aries season. Virgo governed the abdomen, Pisces the feet, and so on. Your medical treatment schedule looked like a horoscope written by someone with a blood fetish. Children and elderly patients received special consideration, which is to say they were bled with slightly smaller instruments. Medieval doctors understood that tiny bodies contained less blood, so they'd use smaller lancets and remove smaller quantities. This was considered enlightened pediatric care. We're only going to drain a little bit of your child's life force. The implements used for bloodletting were often reused without proper cleaning, spreading disease faster than the treatments could cure it. Lancets, scarificators, and cupping instruments passed from patient to patient, carrying infections and bloodborne diseases. Hepatitis, sepsis, and other deadly conditions were spread by the very doctors who were supposed to prevent them. Some patients became addicted to bloodletting, convinced that regular bleeding kept them healthy. They'd return to barber surgeons monthly for maintenance bleeding, like getting a haircut except with more blood loss and higher mortality rates. These bloodletting enthusiasts were walking testimonials to the power of placebo effects and confirmation bias. Chapter 3: Surgery without anesthesia, the original extreme sport. Medieval surgery was less a medical procedure and more an endurance test that separated the living from the dead through sheer determination and luck. Without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper understanding of anatomy, surgery was essentially controlled violence performed by people who had learned their trade through trial and error, emphasis on the error. The patient preparation process was minimal and terrifying. You'd be given some wine or ale to dull the pain, which was about as effective as using a band-aid for a severed limb. Strong men would hold you down while the barber surgeon sharpened his tools. The psychological preparation consisted of prayer, making peace with your maker, and hoping you'd pass out quickly from the pain. Amputation was the most common surgical procedure, usually performed after injuries became infected and gangrenous. The technique was brutally simple. Cut through flesh, muscle, and bone as quickly as possible while the patient was still conscious. Speed was essential because patients could only endure so much agony before going into shock or dying from pain alone. The tools were crude but effective sharp knives, bone saws, and cautery irons heated red-hot to sear wounds closed. There were no precision instruments, no delicate procedures. Medieval surgery was carpentry performed on human bodies, with about the same level of finesse you'd expect from someone building a barn while their materials screamed. Trepanation, or drilling holes in the skull, was performed for headaches, mental illness, and head injuries. The theory was that evil spirits or corrupted humors could escape through the hole, relieving pressure and curing the condition. Patients were held down while surgeons used hand drills to bore through their skulls, often hitting brain tissue and causing permanent damage or death. Cataract surgery involved sticking a needle into the eye to push the clouded lens out of the line of sight. This was done while the patient was fully conscious and trying not to move while someone poked sharp objects into their eyeball. Success rates were low, and blindness or infection were common complications, but at least the procedure was quick. Kidney and bladder stones were removed through external incisions, with surgeons cutting through skin and muscle to reach the stones. Without understanding of internal anatomy, these operations often damaged vital organs or blood vessels. Patients who survived the surgery often died from complications or infections days later. Arrow and spear removal required surgeons to push projectiles completely through the body if they couldn't be extracted backward. This often caused more damage than the original wound, but leaving foreign objects in place guaranteed infection and death. It was a choice between certain death later or probable death immediately. Dental surgery was its own special form of torture. Tooth extraction was performed with crude pliers while patients were held down by assistants. Abscess teeth were lanced with knives, and jaw surgery was attempted with hammer and chisel. Dental anesthesia consisted of getting drunk beforehand and hoping for the best. Cesarean sections were attempted when mothers died during childbirth, with the goal of saving the baby rather than the mother. These post-mortem surgeries had some success, but attempting cesarean sections on living mothers was almost universally fatal. The combination of blood loss, shock, and infection made survival nearly impossible. The surgical environment was far from sterile. Operations were performed in whatever space was available: bedrooms, kitchens, or outdoor areas. Tools were wiped clean with dirty rags, and surgeons wore their regular clothes, often stained with blood from previous patients. The concept of sterile technique was still centuries in the future. Post-surgical care consisted of wrapping wounds with whatever cloth was available and hoping infection didn't set in. Patients who survived the initial procedure faced days or weeks of agony as their bodies tried to heal without proper medical support. Many surgical successes became deaths from complications that could have been easily prevented with modern knowledge. Chapter 4. The Plague Doctor, fashion icon of death. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it created a demand for doctors willing to treat plague victims. Since most physicians had the good sense to flee infected areas, the job fell to plague doctors, medical professionals who combined questionable qualifications with absolutely iconic fashion choices. The plague doctor costume was designed based on the miasma theory of disease transmission, which held that illness spread through bad air or noxious vapors. The famous beaked mask wasn't just for show. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and other substances believed to purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and sometimes more exotic ingredients like ground unicorn horn created a potpourri of hopeful ignorance. The leather coat was designed to prevent plague vapors from penetrating to the skin. These full-length robes were often waxed or oiled to create a supposedly impermeable barrier. Combined with leather gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, the plague doctor looked like a medieval hazmat suit, designed by someone who had never seen actual hazardous materials. The long wooden stick carried by plague doctors served multiple purposes. It allowed them to examine patients without direct contact, point to afflicted areas, and move clothing or bedding without touching it. The stick was also used to keep patients at a safe distance, because apparently 6 feet of wood was an effective barrier against divine punishment in the form of bubonic plague. Plague doctors were often not actual physicians, but rather individuals desperate enough or foolish enough to take on the job. Many were barber surgeons, folk healers, or simply unemployed men who needed work badly enough to risk their lives. Their medical training consisted of whatever knowledge they could scrape together about plague treatment, which wasn't much. The treatments prescribed by plague doctors were a combination of traditional humoral medicine and desperate improvisation. They bled patients to balance their humors, prescribed various herbal concoctions, and attempted to lance the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that were the plague's most visible symptom. These treatments were not only ineffective but often hastened death through additional trauma and blood loss. Payment for plague doctor services was handled differently than normal medical practice. Since patients often died, and their families might flee or also perish, plague doctors were typically paid by towns or authorities rather than individual patients. This created perverse incentives, as doctors were paid regardless of their success rate, which was approximately 0. The psychological toll of being a plague doctor was immense. These individuals watched patient after patient die despite their treatments, often losing entire families in a single day. The isolation required by their profession, they were often quarantined or avoided by healthy people, meant they lived in a constant state of professional and personal hell. Some plague doctors developed their own theories about disease transmission and treatment, often more creative than helpful. They might prescribe specific prayers, dietary changes, or behavioral modifications based on their observations of who lived and who died. These personal medical philosophies were shared with other plague doctors, creating a folklore of plague treatment that was completely disconnected from actual medical knowledge. The mortality rate among plague doctors was predictably high. Despite their protective gear and precautions, many contracted the plague themselves and died within days of their patients. The turnover in this profession was rapid, with new plague doctors constantly being recruited to replace the dead ones. Some plague doctors became wealthy during plague outbreaks, as desperate families would pay enormous sums for any medical attention, no matter how ineffective. These individuals accumulated the belongings of dead patients, inherited from families with no surviving members, creating a grotesque form of pandemic profiteering. The legacy of plague doctors extended beyond the immediate crisis. Their distinctive appearance became associated with death itself in European culture, influencing everything from carnival masks to horror imagery. The beaked mask became a symbol of medieval medicine's powerlessness against disease, a reminder of humanity's vulnerability to forces beyond its understanding or control. Chapter 5. Barber surgeons, your haircut might include amputation. Medieval Europe's medical care was largely provided by barber surgeons, professionals who combined hairdressing with surgical procedures in a career path that makes about as much sense as it sounds. These individuals were responsible for cutting hair, trimming beards, and performing surgery, because apparently having steady hands for shaving qualified you to remove diseased organs. The combination of barbering and surgery wasn't as random as it appears. Both professions required sharp tools, steady hands, and the ability to work on human bodies without fainting. Barbers already owned razors and had experience making precise cuts, so the transition to cutting into people rather than just cutting their hair was seen as a natural career progression. Barber surgeons served as the primary medical care providers for common people who couldn't afford university-trained physicians. While physicians focused on diagnosis and treatment planning based on humoral theory, barber surgeons performed the actual hands-on procedures: bloodletting, tooth extraction, wound treatment, and surgery. They were the medieval equivalent of nurse practitioners, if nurse practitioners also gave you a shave and a haircut. The training for barber surgeons was primarily through apprenticeship rather than formal education. Young men would work with established barber surgeons for several years, learning techniques through observation and practice. This meant that medical knowledge was passed down through generations of practitioners, preserving both useful techniques and dangerous misconceptions with equal enthusiasm. The tools of the trade included razors, scissors, lancets for bloodletting, tooth-pulling instruments, and bone saws for amputations. These implements were used for both barbering and medical procedures, often without proper cleaning between uses. Your haircut might be followed by surgery on the next customer, using the same tools that had just touched your scalp. Barber surgeons were identifiable by their distinctive pole sign, the red and white striped pole that still identifies barbershops today. The red represented blood, the white represented bandages, and the pole itself represented the stick that patients would grip during painful procedures. It was medieval advertising that literally told you what to expect: pain, blood, and hopefully some bandages afterward. The scope of practice for barber surgeons was remarkably broad and terrifying. They performed amputations, removed cataracts, extracted teeth, lanced abscesses, treated wounds, set broken bones, and delivered babies. They were one-stop healthcare providers whose services ranged from cosmetic grooming to life-saving surgery, often with similar success rates. Tooth extraction was a particularly common service provided by barber surgeons. Dental problems were endemic in medieval Europe due to poor nutrition and hygiene, so tooth pulling was a regular part of the job. The procedure involved gripping the tooth with crude pliers and yanking it out, often breaking the tooth or damaging surrounding tissue. Anesthesia consisted of alcohol and prayer. Wound treatment by barber surgeons involved cleaning injuries with wine or other alcohol, applying various poultices and ointments, and wrapping the wound with whatever clean cloth was available. While this was actually better than some contemporary treatments, the lack of understanding about infection meant that many minor wounds became life-threatening complications. Bloodletting was a major source of income for barber surgeons, as it was prescribed for virtually every ailment. They developed efficient techniques for opening veins, managing blood flow, and applying cupping instruments. Some barber surgeons became specialists in bloodletting, developing reputations for their skill in drawing specific amounts of blood without killing the patient. The regulation of barber surgeons varied widely across medieval Europe. Some regions had guilds that established standards and controlled who could practice, while others had minimal oversight. This meant that the quality of care could vary enormously. You might encounter a skilled practitioner who had learned effective techniques, or a complete amateur who had recently decided that surgery looked like easy money. Competition between barber surgeons and university-trained physicians was ongoing and bitter. Physicians looked down on barber surgeons as uneducated manual laborers, while barber surgeons pointed out that they actually performed successful procedures while physicians just talked about humoral theory. This professional rivalry sometimes worked in patients' favor, as both groups tried to prove their superiority through better results. Chapter 6: Medieval Pharmacy, when medicine was just expensive poison. Medieval pharmacies were wonderlands of dangerous substances masquerading as healing remedies. Apothecaries prepared medicines from recipes that combined genuine medicinal plants with toxic metals, animal parts, and substances that would be classified as hazardous waste today. Going to a medieval pharmacy for medicine was like playing Russian roulette, except some of the chambers contained things worse than bullets. The foundation of medieval pharmacy was herbal medicine, which actually contained some genuinely effective remedies. Willow bark contained salicin, a precursor to aspirin. Digitalis from foxglove could treat heart conditions, though the difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose was often discovered through trial and error, emphasis on error. Medieval apothecaries had accumulated centuries of botanical knowledge, unfortunately mixed with centuries of complete nonsense. Heavy metals were popular ingredients in medieval medicines, particularly mercury, lead, and antimony. These substances were believed to have powerful healing properties and were prescribed for everything from skin conditions to mental illness. Mercury was used to treat syphilis, lead was added to medicines for digestive problems, and antimony was prescribed as a general cure-all. The fact that these metals were slowly poisoning patients was not understood, leading to treatments that caused more long-term damage than the original diseases. Animal-based medicines were extremely popular and often completely disgusting. Ground unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, was believed to neutralize poisons and cure various ailments. Powdered mummy was imported from Egypt and prescribed for wounds and internal injuries. Bezoar stones, found in the stomachs of goats, were thought to be universal antidotes. These exotic ingredients were expensive and ineffective, making them perfect status symbols for wealthy hypochondriacs. The preparation of medicines involved complex processes that were part chemistry, part cooking, and part magic ritual. Apothecaries would grind, mix, distill, and ferment various ingredients according to elaborate recipes passed down through generations. The timing was often tied to astrological events. Medicines prepared during certain planetary alignments were believed to be more potent. This added an element of cosmic gambling to pharmaceutical science. Quality control in medieval pharmacies was essentially non-existent. There were no standardized dosages, no purity requirements, and no safety testing. Apothecaries would substitute ingredients based on availability or cost, often without understanding how these changes might affect the medicine's properties. A prescription for one ailment might accidentally become a treatment for something completely different or a poison depending on what was in stock. The cost of medieval medicines was astronomical, making healthcare accessible only to the wealthy. Exotic ingredients had to be imported across vast distances, often changing hands multiple times before reaching the apothecary. A single dose of medicine might cost more than a laborer's monthly wages, creating a healthcare system where the rich received expensive poisons while the poor relied on folk remedies that were often more effective. Theriac was the most famous and complex medieval medicine, a supposed universal antidote that contained up to 100 different ingredients. The recipe included viper's flesh, opium, various herbs, spices, and exotic animal parts. Preparing theriac was an elaborate public ceremony that took months to complete and required ingredients from across the known world. It was the medieval equivalent of a luxury sports car, expensive, impressive, and probably not worth the cost. Dosage recommendations were often based on the patient's astrological sign, the phase of the moon, and the physician's intuition rather than any scientific understanding of how medicines work. Patients might be told to take their medicine only on Tuesdays, or to consume it while facing east, or to mix it with wine blessed by a priest. These elaborate instructions made the medicine seem more powerful while providing convenient excuses when it didn't work. Many medieval medicines contained opium, alcohol, or other genuinely psychoactive substances, which meant they actually did make patients feel different, even if they didn't cure the underlying condition. This created a placebo effect that convinced both patients and physicians that the medicines were working. Patients felt better temporarily, physicians got credit for the improvement, and the cycle of expensive, ineffective treatment continued. The preservation of medicines was a constant challenge in an era without refrigeration or proper containers. Many preparations spoiled quickly, growing mold or fermenting into toxic substances. Apothecaries developed various techniques for preserving their products, including adding alcohol, salt, or sugar, but spoiled medicine remained a common problem. Patients were often getting expired pharmaceuticals that had degraded into something completely different from what was originally prescribed. Storage and labeling of medicines was haphazard at best. Apothecaries kept their preparations in whatever containers were available: clay pots, wooden boxes, or animal bladders. Labeling was often minimal or non-existent, leading to cases where patients received completely wrong medicines. The potential for deadly mix-ups was enormous, and probably contributed to the general medieval assumption that medicine was inherently dangerous. Conclusion: why modern medicine is actually miraculous. As we wrap up our tour through the nightmare that was medieval medicine, it's worth reflecting on just how far we've come. Every time you take an aspirin for a headache, receive anesthesia for surgery, or get antibiotics for an infection, you're benefiting from advances that would seem like magic to a medieval physician. The development of the germ theory of disease revolutionized medicine by providing an accurate understanding of how illnesses spread. Instead of blaming bad air or imbalanced humors, doctors finally understood that tiny organisms were causing disease, leading to innovations in sanitation, sterilization, and treatment that actually worked. Modern surgical techniques, performed under sterile conditions with effective anesthesia, have transformed procedures that were once death sentences into routine operations with high success rates. The medieval patient facing amputation had perhaps a 50% chance of survival, while modern patients can undergo complex surgeries with mortality rates measured in fractions of a percent. The discovery and development of antibiotics has eliminated diseases that terrorized medieval populations. Infections that would have been fatal in the Middle Ages can now be cured with a simple course of pills. The Black Death, which killed 1/3 of Europe's population, would be treatable with modern medicine. So the next time you're sitting in a doctor's office, waiting for your appointment while reading outdated magazines and complaining about healthcare costs, Remember that you're not being bled with dirty lancets, you're not drinking mercury-based medicines, and your surgeon actually washes their hands before operating. In the grand scheme of medical history, you're living in unprecedented luxury. Sleep well, knowing that if you wake up with a headache tomorrow, the cure won't involve drilling holes in your skull or consulting your astrological chart. Modern medicine, for all its flaws, is basically miraculous compared to the medieval alternative. Sweet dreams, and try not to think about what medical care was like before people figured out that maybe, just maybe, cleanliness and scientific understanding were more important than tradition and wishful thinking. Thanks for joining me on this journey through medical history's greatest hits of human suffering. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this descent into healthcare hell, and let me know in the comments what other historical nightmares you'd like me to explore. Until next time, stay healthy, and remember, you're living in the best possible time in human history to get sick.